Delighted to be presenting to you today a paper called Responding to COVID as a Workforce, the Example of Lebanon. It is presented by three authors, Madam Hil Khouri, who is the Director of DOPS at the Lebanese Republic's Ministry of Education and Higher Education, and by Dr. Orville Adams and myself, Tom Pugh, who are both consultants in the Oxford Policy Management Technical Assistance Team, where we've been embedded in the Ministry of Education to provide technical assistance, capacity building and delivery support for the last 3.5 years. So therefore must be said that this paper is not a third-party evaluation of the Ministry's response to COVID, but instead is an account of some of the specific interventions put in place from the perspective of some of those who are deeply involved in implementing those. It will focus on decrees issued, what was prioritised, where possible it will look at the impact of its actions on students and learners, and it will focus predominantly on Lebanon's public schools. It's not been possible to include the implementation review components in this presentation. They'll come in a paper alongside this presentation later on. So one of the first things necessary to talk about is the situation that Lebanon was when the pandemic hit. A period of civil unrest had caused the resignation of the government, and a caretaker government was in place in early 2020. The economic crisis as a result of that had led to the devaluation of the Lebanese lira. And on top of that, there was the influx of approximately 500,000 Syrian refugee children of school-going age who were all accommodated in Lebanese public schools. Context in the sector is that there are traditional learning teaching styles predominated around the country. Many teachers had limited IT skills, and there were a large number of contractual teachers on fixed-term contracts. On top of that, the infrastructure context, so there's unstable electricity supply, schools didn't always have internet connection, households didn't always have sufficient devices, and the cost of data for mobile phones was relatively high. So this was the timeline of how things unraveled in Lebanon. I would like to focus on the left-hand side of the 13th of March, which was an announcement by the minister that the schools were going to close and the country was going to move to a national distance learning project. As I remember, that was on a Friday afternoon that it was announced, and that remote learning would start as soon as the Monday after. So there was an extensive period of closure until October 2020, where some schools went back for a short period, and then they closed again, and then there was more widespread reopening in around April 2021. So we're talking about quite a significant period of time here. The model that was being put forward is very similar to what you have seen in other countries. When it went back to low risk in terms of COVID, there was to be face-to-face. Medium risk was to be a period of hybrid learning. And when COVID was very predominant, there was going to be a period of entire e-learning. In Lebanon, e-learning looked like TV content broadcast on the national television station Tele Lebanon and focusing on examination grades, lots of different access to digital resources in the country that were available online, virtual classrooms, both a Microsoft Teams platform, which was set up quite quickly after the pandemic, and a learning management system called Classera that took a bit longer to procure, and some low-tech solutions for those not able to access the e-learning. The fundamentals of what the Minister of Education did was it announced the closure of schools and switched immediately to remote learning. It set up a cross-government remote learning steering committee to focus on these issues, including on workforce and teaching issues. There was immediate focus for the rest of the year on examination grades, and as I mentioned, rapid production of large volumes of TV programs that were broadcast on the state television channel. Procured 1 million Microsoft Teams licenses in conjunction with Microsoft for all teachers and all students in the country. There were a large number of digital content platforms set up, so students could access digital content, and there was a learning management system that was procured as well. So the successes of this were that quite swiftly afterwards, the legislation was changed to allow teachers to be paid for remote learning. Previously, teachers had to be in school to be clocked in and clocked out for them to be paid. So this was necessary, obviously, for remote learning to be possible. There was also some very, very swift training of teachers on the Microsoft Teams platform that was cascaded down to all teachers across the country. And there was some additional training given to special educators to make sure that from an inclusive point of view, inclusive remote learning was also prioritised. I mentioned before the problems with electricity and internet connectivity. There was also a huge amount of uneven readiness of teachers to use the IT in order to teach. And that MEHE's support to such a large number of recently trained teachers was strained extremely by the quick onset of moving to remote learning. And as mentioned, there was a large focus on the examination grades to start with, at the expense potentially of the lower grades. And the successes in terms of teaching and learning, that, as I mentioned, there were 1 million Microsoft Teams licenses for all students. Those then had to be mapped and credentials given out. And within 6 months, about 350,000 students had been given credentials and were using the Microsoft Teams platform. There were over 3,000 digital resources catalogued and mapped to the Lebanese curriculum and catalogued online. There was the giving out of at least one laptop per school, so that every school had a laptop and a stable internet connection to be able to teach remotely. And then there were negotiations with telecom companies to offset the cost of data on mobile devices. There were issues with the numbers of devices. There were then issues with the quality and equity of distance learning, and good quality monitoring data was hard to come by. How to examine students in disrupted years was very difficult. And as I mentioned, there were problems with actually procuring the learning management system. So that's a very brief run through for you on the response of Lebanon to the COVID pandemic. We are very welcome to questions and comments from you now. Thank you very much.